Hi, you're on a rock, and this rock has been spinning quietly in space for about 4.5 billion years, and in all that time, a lot of stuff happened on it. Some of it was genuinely fascinating. Most of it was people hitting each other with slightly different weapons and arguing about who owned which patch of dirt. But here's the thing, out of all that chaos, somehow, we built cities, wrote poems, sailed to the other side of the planet, and occasionally sent robots to other rocks. So let's figure out how we got from confused ape with a pointy stick to, well, this dot okay. Let's go back. Way back. Stop. Right there. This is called the Paleolithic era, or the Stone Age. And yes, it's called the Stone Age because that's genuinely all they had: stone tools, sharpened rocks, rocks tied to other rocks, rocks shaped into rocks that look like nicer rocks. For about 3 million years. That was the whole human toolkit. Not a lot going on, but here's what is impressive. Around 300 years ago, Homo sapiens showed up. That's us. And almost immediately, we started doing something none of the other animals really bothered with. We started asking why. Cave paintings, ritual burials, early jewelry made from shells. These are signs of symbolic thinking, imagining things that don't exist yet, planning for a future that, as it turns out, is a superpower. And we used that superpower to walk everywhere. Starting in Africa, humans migrated across the entire planet over tens of thousands of years, to Europe, to Asia, all the way to the tip of South America. They even crossed into Australia, which required boats. And that is a huge deal because boats don't exactly grow on trees. Well, actually, they kind of do, but you have to build them first. So humans spread, and then, about 12,000 years ago, buckle up, the agricultural revolution happened. Somebody, and we genuinely don't know exactly who, figured out that instead of chasing food around for miles every day, you could just put seeds in the ground right there, next to where you sleep, and then wait, and food would come to you. Revolutionary, literally, because once you can grow food in one place, you stop wandering. And when you stop wandering, you start accumulating stuff. You store grain, you build permanent houses, you get a surplus, and a surplus is where things get interesting, because now not everyone has to farm. Some people can specialize. You get potters, traders, priests, soldiers, and inevitably, kings who say, hey, all that surplus, yeah, that's mine now. And thus, taxes were invented. You're welcome. Everyone, boom, civilization. The first ones we know well showed up around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, which is basically modern Iraq. The Sumerians built the first real cities, Uruk, Eridu, and they invented writing, cuneiform, little wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. Cool. Writing, poetry, philosophy, you might think. Wrong. The first written records are grain receipts, accounting. The oldest surviving text is basically a spreadsheet tracking barley deliveries. History is like that. But fine, writing is writing, and it changes everything. Because now you can store information outside your head. You can send messages, pass laws, tell stories, build up knowledge over generations instead of starting from scratch every time someone dies. This is arguably the most important invention in human history, and we used it first to count sheep. Simultaneously, over in Egypt, another civilization was doing its thing along the Nile River. The Nile flooded every year like clockwork, leaving behind incredibly fertile soil, which meant reliable food, which meant stable population, which meant people had time to think about bigger projects, like, say, building enormous stone triangles in the desert. The pyramids at Giza were built around 2560 BCE. They're so precisely engineered that modern architects are still kind of baffled, and the Egyptians did this with copper tools and human muscle. No cranes, no steel, just an absolutely unhinged level of organizational competence and the labor of tens of thousands of workers. The Egyptians also had pharaohs, who were considered literal living gods, which is an extremely convenient belief system if you were the pharaoh, and somewhat less convenient if you were everyone else. Okay, so now we've got civilizations popping up all over the place. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan and India, and the Yellow River in China, all roughly around the same era, all independently figuring out cities, writing, laws, and rulers who like nice hats. Historians call this the Bronze Age, because by now people have figured out how to smelt metal. Bronze, copper mixed with tin, was harder than stone and much better for making weapons and tools. Whoever had better bronze had a serious advantage. International trade networks formed specifically to get the right metals to the right places. The ancient world was surprisingly globalized. Then around 1200 BCE, something wild happened, something historians literally call the Bronze Age collapse. In the span of about 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the Mediterranean and Near East just fell apart. Egypt weakened dramatically, the Hittite Empire, gone, the Mycenaean Greeks, vanished. Dozens of cities burned and were never rebuilt. We still don't fully know why. Climate change, earthquakes, internal rebellions, mysterious raiders called the Sea Peoples, probably all of the above at once. It's one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in history. Entire civilizations erased, like closing a bunch of browser tabs at once. But out of the rubble came the Iron Age. Iron is actually weaker than bronze in some ways, but iron ore is way more common than tin, so suddenly everyone could make metal tools and weapons, not just the rich and well-connected. Technology democratizes. Interesting things start happening, like, for example, the Phoenicians, small city-states on the coast of modern Lebanon, who became the great maritime traders of the ancient world. They sailed across the entire Mediterranean and established colonies from Cyprus to Spain. They also spread their alphabet, a simple system of letters representing sounds, which got adapted by the Greeks, then the Romans, and is the direct ancestor of the alphabet you're reading right now. So every time you text someone, there's a little Phoenician DNA in that message. Speaking of Greeks, oh boy, the ancient Greeks, 800 to 146 BCE, roughly. These people were absolutely bursting with ideas. Democracy, the radical notion that citizens should participate in their own government, was invented in Athens around 507 BCE by a guy named Cleisthenes. Simultaneously, Greek philosophers were running around asking questions like, what is reality made of? And what does it mean to live a good life? And why do heavy things fall? Thales, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They're basically the founding fathers of Western philosophy, science, and logic. Also, the Greeks were catastrophically bad at getting along with each other. The city-states fought constantly. Athens versus Sparta is the famous rivalry, completely different societies. Athens more intellectual and commercial, Sparta more militaristic and, let's say, aggressively minimalist. They teamed up exactly once to fight off a Persian invasion, which resulted in the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Yes, that's where the running race comes from. And the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, where 300 Spartans famously held off a massive Persian army for 3 days. They all died, but still, points for drama. Then after defeating Persia, Athens and Sparta immediately went back to fighting each other in the Peloponnesian War, which exhausted everyone. And then a guy from the north showed up and conquered the whole thing. That guy's name was Alexander. Most people call him the Great, which is one of history's more impressive resumed bullet points. Alexander of Macedon conquered Greece, then Persia, then Egypt, then kept going all the way to India, all by the age of 32. He then died young and his empire immediately split into pieces, but not before spreading Greek culture across an enormous chunk of the world. This period is called the Hellenistic Age. Greek ideas mixed with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian influences, a cultural smoothie, a very influential cultural smoothie. Meanwhile, on a set of hills next to a river in central Italy, a small city was doing something interesting. Rome started as a tiny republic around 509 BCE. The key innovation, 2 consuls, elected annually, each with veto power over the other, an early, imperfect, but genuine attempt at preventing one person from grabbing all the power. It mostly worked, for a while. Rome was also really good at one particular thing, absorbing. They lost battles and came back. They encountered new cultures and stole the best ideas. They built roads, absolutely fantastic roads, some of which are still in use, and these roads connected their growing empire and allowed armies and goods and information to move at unprecedented speed. Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman administration, these shaped Europe for the next 2,000 years. But you know what's hard to maintain? A republic. Especially after you conquer the entire Mediterranean, the republic got strained by wealth, inequality, endless wars, and ambitious generals. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE with his army, which was explicitly illegal, and everyone knew it meant civil war, and said, essentially, yeah, I know. He won, he became dictator. Then his friends stabbed him 23 times in the Senate chamber on March 15, 44 BCE. In what history records as a spectacular misunderstanding of how to prevent autocracy, his assassins thought removing Caesar would restore the Republic. Instead, it triggered more civil war and led directly to his adopted son Octavian becoming Rome's first emperor, Augustus. In 27 BCE, the Roman Empire at its peak controlled territory from Scotland to Iraq. Around 70 million people lived under Roman rule. It was, in many ways, the ancient world's greatest act of political engineering, and it lasted, in various forms, for another 400 years in the West, and 1,000 more in the East as the Byzantine Empire. Not bad in the East. China was also doing enormous things that the West mostly didn't hear about for centuries. The Qin Emperor unified China into 21 BCE, which sounds simple but was essentially the equivalent of Julius Caesar conquering all of Europe, and standardized weights, measures, writing, and coinage across a vast territory. He also started building the Great Wall, connecting existing fortifications into one massive defensive structure. Then came the Han Dynasty, roughly contemporary with the Roman Empire and similar in size and population, which established the Silk Road, a network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Rome. Silk, spices, glassware, and ideas flowed in both directions. The world was getting smaller. Oh, and speaking of ideas flowing around, somewhere in the Roman province of Judea, around 30 CE, a preacher named Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. His followers believed he rose from the dead. A small sect called Christianity formed. The Romans tried to stamp it out, which did not work, and by 313 CE Emperor Constantine officially tolerated it, and by 380 CE it was the official religion of the Roman Empire. One of history's great reversals, the empire that executed Christianity's founder eventually became its greatest promoter, from a small persecuted group to the dominant spiritual force of Western civilization in about 350 years. That's a glow up. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE. The reasons are still debated: overextension, economic troubles, climate change, plague, invasions from migrating peoples, the Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, probably all of the above. Again, the infrastructure collapsed, cities shrank, literacy declined, trade networks frayed. This is what historians used to call the Dark Ages, though modern historians prefer early Middle Ages because it was actually more complicated then. Pure darkness, but compared to Roman aqueducts and legal codes, yeah, things got rougher for a while. Meanwhile, in 610 CE in the Arabian Peninsula, a merchant named Muhammad began receiving what he believed were divine revelations. He started preaching, was persecuted, fled to Medina, returned, and within his lifetime unified much of Arabia under a new religion, Islam. After his death in 632, his followers exploded outward in one of history's most dramatic and rapid expansions. Within 100 years, the Islamic Caliphate stretched from Spain to Central Asia. They preserved and translated Greek texts that Europe had forgotten. They made huge advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The word algebra is Arabic. The numerals you're using right now -1, 2, 3 are called Arabic numerals for a reason. The Middle Ages in Europe, from roughly 500 to 1500 CE, were defined by feudalism, a pyramid of land, loyalty, and military service. Kings granted land to lords, lords granted land to knights. Knights protected peasants. Peasants worked the land and gave most of the harvest up the pyramid. The Catholic Church sat above all of this as the dominant spiritual and often political authority. The Pope could tell kings what to do. Sometimes kings listened, sometimes they didn't. Always dramatic. Then came 1347, the Black Death, bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rats, arrived in Europe from Central Asia and killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population in 5 years. Stop and think about that. Half gone, villages emptied, social structures that had been stable for centuries shattered almost overnight. And in the chaos and grief, something interesting happened. The survivors had leverage. Suddenly there were fewer workers. Peasants could demand better wages. The old feudal order started creaking. The Black Death is one of the grimmest events in human history and also, accidentally, a major driver of social and economic change. Out of the disruptions of the 14th and 15th centuries came the Renaissance, rebirth, starting in the wealthy city-states of Italy. Artists and thinkers turned back to classical Greek and Roman ideas and mixed them with new techniques and perspectives. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa, designed flying machines, studied anatomy, and somehow found time to write backwards in his notebooks. Michelangelo spent 4 years on his back painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Gutenberg invented the printing press around 1440, which was quietly the most disruptive technology since writing itself. Suddenly books could be mass-produced, ideas could spread faster than authorities could suppress them, and literacy exploded. Speaking of things exploding, in 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, the last remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, ending a civilization that had technically been continuous since Augustus, in just a few decades. Later, in 1492, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, funded by Spain, crossed the Atlantic Ocean and bumped into a couple of continents that Europe didn't know existed. He thought he'd found a shortcut to Asia. He had not. He had found the Americas, inhabited by an estimated 50 to 100 million people whose ancestors had been there for over 10,000 years. This meeting of worlds was catastrophic for the indigenous populations. European diseases alone killed between 50% and 90% of the native population in the decades that followed. But it also permanently and irreversibly linked the old world and the new, triggering global trade, global colonialism, and an exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and people that reshaped every continent on Earth. History calls this the Columbian exchange. You're eating tomatoes and potatoes in Europe because of it. You're eating maize and chocolate because of it. It's everywhere. Back in Europe, the printing press had been spreading ideas dangerously fast. And in 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed a list of complaints about the Catholic Church to a door in Wittenberg. Okay, he may have actually just mailed them, but he definitely published them. The printing presses ran hot, and the Protestant Reformation exploded across Europe. Christianity split. Enormous religious wars followed, killing millions. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 killed perhaps a third of the German-speaking population out of sheer exhaustion. European states eventually agreed to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established the idea that nations have sovereignty, the right to govern themselves without external religious interference. The modern concept of the nation-state was born out of tired people desperately wanting the wars to stop. Meanwhile, the scientific revolution was quietly dismantling everything. Copernicus proposed the Earth orbits the Sun in 1543. Galileo built a telescope and confirmed it, and was put under house arrest by the Inquisition, which did not make heliocentrism less true. Kepler worked out the mathematics of planetary orbits, and then, in 1687, Isaac Newton published his laws of motion and universal gravitation. Wait, you've heard about him? Yeah, gravity guy. The universe suddenly had rules, predictable, mathematical, elegant rules. The idea that humans could use reason to understand nature, the Enlightenment, spread from science to politics. John Locke wrote that people have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Voltaire mocked religious intolerance. Rousseau talked about popular sovereignty. These ideas filtered into a few places where they had very large consequences. In 1776, a collection of British colonies in North America declared independence, basing their argument explicitly on Enlightenment principles. The American Revolution. Then in 1789, France, deep in debt, with a starving population and an oblivious aristocracy, exploded. The French Revolution. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Also, the guillotine, the terror, and eventually Napoleon Bonaparte, a short Corsican artillery officer who conquered most of Europe and in the process accidentally spread the revolutionary ideals of nationalism and popular sovereignty to every country he invaded. He got exiled twice. The ideas did not get exiled with him. The 19th century, industrialization, Britain first, then everywhere, steam engines, coal, factories, railways. For the first time in human history, economic output stopped being limited by the amount of muscle, human or animal, you could deploy. Productivity exploded, cities exploded, population exploded. Also, urban working conditions were frequently horrific. Child labor, 14 nowadays, no safety regulations. Karl Marx looked at all of this and wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, arguing that history is driven by class struggle and that capitalism would eventually be overthrown by workers. That idea would go on to shape the 20th century more than almost any other. Also in the 19th century, European empires were carving up the rest of the world with shocking speed and efficiency. By 1914, European powers directly controlled about 84% of the Earth's land surface. The British Empire alone covered roughly a quarter of the globe. India, most of Africa, Southeast Asia, chunks of the Middle East, all colonized. resources extracted, local population subjected to foreign rule. The consequences of this, economic, cultural, political, are still very much with us today. Then, in Sarajevo, on June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip shot the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And because Europe had spent decades building interlocking military alliances, this single assassination triggered a chain reaction that dragged almost every major nation on Earth into World War I, the war to end all wars, fought mostly in trenches. Machine guns made cavalry charges suicidal, poison gas was used for the first time, 10 million soldiers died, the old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, German, all collapsed. The map of the world was redrawn, and the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, imposed such humiliating and economically crushing terms on Germany that it basically set up the conditions for the next disaster. The 1920s, economic boom, cultural explosion, jazz, the 1929 stock market crash, the Great Depression, unemployment, poverty, despair across the industrialized world, and in that despair, political extremism flourished. In Germany, a charismatic and deeply unhinged Austrian ex-corporal named Adolf Hitler channeled national humiliation and economic misery into fascism, anti-Semitism, and the Nazi Party. He became chancellor in 1933. By 1939, he invaded Poland, and World War II began, the deadliest conflict in human history, somewhere between 70 and 85 million people killed. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others. The atomic bomb, dropped on Hiroshima, Nagasaki in August 1945, killing around 200,000 people instantly and ending the war in the Pacific. Humanity had discovered how to make extinction-level weapons. That's the kind of thing you'd really prefer to figure out after you've achieved world peace. But here we are, after the war. Two superpowers emerged from the rubble, the United States and the Soviet Union. They disagreed about basically everything: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus one-party state. They never directly fought each other, that was the cold part, but they funded proxy wars everywhere, built enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization multiple times over, and competed furiously in science, technology, and space. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957. The United States landed humans on the moon in 1969. That particular competition produced some genuinely spectacular results for humanity. Meanwhile, the old European empires were collapsing. The independence movements that had been building for decades burst open after the war. India in 1947, dozens of African nations through the 1950s and 60s. The process was often messy, violent, and left behind borders drawn arbitrarily by colonial powers with no regard for ethnic, cultural, or tribal realities. Many of today's conflicts trace directly back to those lines on colonial maps. The Cold War finally, unexpectedly, ended when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Berlin Wall had come down in 1989. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms spiraled beyond his control. One of the two superpowers simply ceased to exist. Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous essay called The End of History, suggesting liberal democracy had won and history was basically over. He was, how do we put this, incorrect, and so here we are. Out of all those billions of years of a spinning rock, about 300,000 years of humans, 12,000 years of civilization, thousands of empires built and collapsed, billions of individual lives with their own stories and loves and fears and ideas, we have arrived at the present moment, with all its complexity, all its unresolved questions, all its inherited problems and inherited achievements. The key thing to remember about history is that it is not a series of inevitable events. At almost every turning point, things could have gone differently. Different decisions, different diseases, different weather on a particular battlefield. History is made by humans under specific circumstances, which means humans under different circumstances can make it differently. Also, almost every generation thought they were living at the most important, most dramatic, most pivotal moment in history, and they were usually right. It's always the most important,